is a professor in animal science with the Applied Swine Nutrition Group, and has a presentation for you about the four important things about water that you need to know.
Great, thank you very much. So, pleasure to be here. This is our last meeting, so I've had 3 chances before this one to get my talk right. So if I haven't got it right by now, then I don't have a 5th chance. But I enjoy talking about water, and we picked 4 topics to deal with on water. They are the 4 topics that seem to come up in questions most frequently, so that's how we chose the topics. Before we get into that, just very quickly, here's bottled water that costs anything from, I don't know, 40 cents a bottle to $5 a bottle, depending where you buy it. And 25% of the bottled water in the market is pulled out of a tap. And I can take that water out of my tap in Ames, Iowa for less than a penny, that bottle of water. So people take their water very seriously and have their own opinions on what's good water or not. Now, the pH of this water is probably, we'll say 6.5 is probably more like 7.5. And the pH of this water, Coca-Cola, is 2.5. So the difference between regular water and Coca-Cola is a pH difference of about 5 units, which means there's 100,000, because it's a log scale, what we call a log scale, there's 100,000 times more acid in Coke than there is in regular water. So that's probably why when you were growing up, your mommy told you you shouldn't be drinking Coca-Cola. But let's move on to more serious topics.
Actually, a quick question on that, Nathan.
Yeah.
So, big trend right now is drinking water with high pH.
Yeah.
I worked for when someone did bunch of pHs on dairy farms, and I would use pH strips. I would test the water. If I drink a lot of water,
Right.
I never got it to be 9. When I tested it, it was always at like a 7.
Yeah.
So, do you know anything about that?
We are in fact going to talk about that, but I'm glad you actually asked the question, because it's one of my favorite topics, and for the most part, there's specific situations, but for the most part, doesn't matter. Okay. So these are the 4 topics that we're going to talk about this afternoon. What do I measure if I want to assess the quality of my water? And what do the results mean if I get the results back? How do I interpret them? How does water quality affect the health and performance of my pigs? And what can I do about it? The third is, what is biofilm? That's a topic that has come up a lot more in the last 5 or 10 years. We never used to talk about biofilm, and now we talk about it a lot. So what does it mean, and what can I do about it? Or what should I do about it? And then we're also using drinking water to deliver medication and sometimes vaccines to pigs a whole lot more now than we used to as well. So I want to talk about the challenges that are there. So when we talk about analyzing water, I like to break the analyses down into 2 categories. What I call level 1 or the sentinels. Those are the ones you'd analyze just to get a very general view is, do I need to worry about my water or not? And if you analyze those and everything comes back well, then you're probably okay. You don't need to go any further. But if one of them's off, then you want to go further and get more information. So you want to test for coliforms, and especially fecal coliforms, because that'll help you to know, is there any kind of contamination of the water with organic matter? And can it possibly be contaminated with not just E. coli, but something else? You'd want to take that further. Total dissolved solids is just the sum of all the minerals that are in water. And so if it's low, then you know the minerals are low. And then hardness, I could have put in level 1 or level 2, and we're going to talk about hardness. But hardness is something that certainly in your household you're interested in, and perhaps in your barn, as we're just about to talk about. Did I hit the black button? There. Yeah, I turned the screen off. I do that from time to time. I have not changed. So what does water hardness mean, and what does it not mean? Does water hardness affect the health of my pigs or the performance of my pigs? And directly, no, it does not. The pigs really don't care, other than if I'm a person drinking water, I tend to prefer to drink hard water because it's got minerals in it, and the mineral brings some flavor with it. Because if you drink water with no minerals in it at all, then it doesn't have any flavor, because water by itself has no flavor. So, so that's one thing to keep in mind. But I grew up on a farm where we had very, very hard water on the farm, and we never did anything about it. Back in those days, you didn't like to spend money on anything anyhow. And, but we were quite happy to have hard water because it tasted good. Wasn't so nice when it came to trying to maintain hot water heaters and those kinds of things. And that's where it becomes a problem in your barns, because hardness, as you can see in the picture here, can accumulate scale inside your water delivery system there. And that can, over time, can reduce the flow rate in your water system, and over time can reduce the flow rate so that your nipple drinkers are no longer delivering enough water. And by the way, that's just a reminder to me to mention that a lot of the issues with water quality, they kind of sneak up on you over time. It's not like you walk into your barn and say, oh my gosh, I've got a water problem today. It's like you've got something going on in the background, and it might be hardness, it might be something else, it might be iron bacteria. For example, if you have iron bacteria in your well, those bacteria produce a slime which coats the casing of the well. And at first that slows the production of the well, but your well already had excess production, so you don't notice it. Well, then there's more slime and the production of the well gets lower still, but you still have enough water coming out of the well to meet your needs. But then at some point, the slime takes over and now you're not getting enough water, and now you notice it because your pigs aren't getting enough water or your house is running short of water. And that's the kind of thing that happens so frequently with water issues. And if you can deal with the iron bacteria early, then it's not such a terrible problem to solve. But if you've got a well that's heavily plugged by iron bacteria, that can be really, really difficult. So iron hardness obviously increases the need for soap to use in the laundry. And some people, that's important to them, and other people, they just live with it and really don't care. Hardness is really the sum of calcium and magnesium, two minerals. And so if the sum of those two minerals is less than 17 parts per million, you have soft water and you don't need to worry. If it's over 120 parts per million, then you have hard water. And if you're over 160 parts per million, you have very hard water. And then you can decide whether I want to invest in a water softener to reduce that hardness. And I would think there's no need to do it for the water your pigs are drinking. You might do it in your office area for showers and laundry and those kinds of things, because that hardness and that scale can build up in nipple drinkers and reduce flow rate that way as well. So it can affect your pigs indirectly, but not directly. Keep in mind that if you use an ion exchange water softener, the kind of softener that you add salt to, what that ion exchange softener does is it replaces the calcium and magnesium with sodium. And it does it on a 2-to-1 basis. So for every calcium molecule it takes out, it puts in 2 molecules of sodium. So keep that in mind. If you do decide to soften your water, you're greatly increasing the sodium content of that water. So let's move on to the next topic, which is sulfates, because that's the one we get a lot of questions about, because high sulfates are really frustrating if you're working a barn. If you have more than 500 parts per million of sulfates in your drinking water, you are running a risk that your nursery pigs are going to have diarrhea right after weaning. And the higher that sulfate goes, the worse will be the diarrhea. But the point that's very, very important, take-home message, is that pigs can drink water with a lot of sulfate in it and have really profuse diarrhea, like you see in the picture, but it doesn't affect their performance at all. You have to get really, really high in sulfates to affect animal performance, at least 1,500, probably more like 2,000 parts per million of sulfate to actually affect performance. The sulfates can contribute to that rotten egg odor. If you've got sulfur bacteria in the water, they'll take that sulfate and convert it to H2S, hydrogen sulfide, which is the rotten egg, the source of the rotten egg odor. And so sulfates can affect you in that manner as well. And the only way to remove sulfates from the water is through reverse osmosis. There is no other way that's practical, at least. You can distill water like we do in a lab, but that's not practical for a barn. It's frightfully expensive, and the technology is difficult. And I'm just going to give you an example of a farm that called us in. This is quite a few years ago now, 1200 South, single site, fair to finish barn. Had a terrible time with sulfates in their water. The sulfates were running over 1,600 parts per million. The staff were complaining to the owner about this, and it was affecting their performance. And he went out and he spent, back then, $300,000 for a reverse osmosis unit. And within 6 months, because it wasn't installed properly, he had to replace the filters, because those filters are really, really sensitive. For example, if there's iron in the water, the iron just eats alive the filters that are in a reverse osmosis unit. So you have to put in an iron filter ahead of your reverse osmosis unit. So if you look at the data, we ran the trial, and certainly the pigs getting 1,650 parts per million had terrible diarrhea, just like they said. The reverse osmosis unit brought that sulfate down to 29 parts per million, but you'll notice it had absolutely no effect on performance. So the owner wasn't very pleased to hear that. The people in the barn just wouldn't believe it, because they say, well, look at the pigs. You can tell by just looking at them that they're not performing well. And we said, well, they're dirty, but they are performing well, but we'll rerun the trial just to see. And so we reran the trial and got essentially the exact same results. Lots and lots of diarrhea, no effect on performance. And there's been many, many other trials that have been run showing the exact same thing. So we know that pigs can handle the sulfate, but they sure don't look very pretty. Okay, so keep that in mind. The one thing that we don't know about sulfates in the water is if pigs are getting drinking water with sulfates in it and get this diarrhea, are they then more susceptible to other kinds of pathogens in the gut? In other words, is there a breakdown or a change in the physiology within the gut that they are more susceptible to diarrhea due to E. coli or other pathogens? And unfortunately, to the best of my knowledge, that trial's never been run. Okay, the next one, which I think is more of a real problem, certainly a frustration, is iron in the water. And you can see the picture here. You get that red, brownish red stain in your fixtures in your house and in the barn. And iron can be really, really problematic. Not so much that it causes a health problem, but it really messes up your water system. When iron is in the water, I'm gonna take this off. When iron is in the water in the ground, it's soluble. So it just flows with the water very easily. But as soon as you pump that water to the surface, it gets exposed to oxygen, and you convert the iron to iron oxide, which is another word for rust. And it doesn't dissolve in water at all. It just settles down. So you have high iron in your water, it settles out. If you don't filter it out, it will plug up your water lines. It'll stain certain fixtures, whether you care about that or not, but it will tend to plug up your system. It loves to plug up nipple drinkers and anything in your whole system that has narrow, small orifices in it. So iron in the water can be a really, really frustrating thing to have. Now, the good news about iron is you can relatively easily remove it from the water. You put in an iron filter. It's a 3-step process. If you happen to have a barn, and more sow barns are being built with cisterns, so the water from the well is pumped into the cistern and then from the cistern to the barn. If you happen to have a cistern, then some of that iron is going to settle out just naturally. If you want to speed it up, just pump air into your cistern. And the more oxygen that water is exposed to, the more iron converts over to iron oxide and settles out. And if you want to stimulate it even more, you can chlorinate the water, and which isn't a bad idea, because if you have a cistern, you don't want bacteria growing in the cistern. But chlorination will also stimulate the conversion of iron to iron oxide and also help to settle it out. And so that's something to keep in mind If you have a problem with iron, manganese can cause the same problem. Iron, we want it less than 0.3 parts per million, so it doesn't cause us problems. Manganese, we want it at less than 0.05 parts per million. Now, I've already talked to you about iron bacteria, and they're kind of bad news for the reasons that I explained to you. Now we move on to nitrate and nitrite. This is the most serious topic when it comes to human health. We think it's much less so for animal health. But in young human infants, if they are fed formula and not breastfed, and the formula is made with water that's high in nitrate, you get what's called blue baby syndrome, because the nitrate and nitrite robs the blood of the ability to transfer oxygen from your lungs to the cells. Very serious issue. Now, there's treatments for it. If somebody isn't aware of this and they see their child developing a blue hue, there's treatment for it, which is fairly rapid, but you really want to prevent it. You don't want to get to that point. The research that's been done on nitrates and nitrites in pigs, it's never been studied in very young pigs because those pigs are almost always nursing the sow. But after weaning and older, they've fed levels. The last trial I looked at, they fed 300 parts per million of nitrates to adult pigs, and it didn't affect them in any way at all. Had no effect. So for humans, we want nitrates to be less than 10 parts per million and nitrates less than 1 parts per million. For pigs, the standard is 100 parts per million of nitrate and 10 parts per million for nitrite. But I think that's a pretty conservative number. pH, we've already talked a little bit about pH, and to your question now, I'll answer it better, okay? And as I say on my slide, much is made of the pH of water, and I can honestly say I have not seen a single study that shows the pig can tell the difference between water with a pH of 6.5 or a pH of 7. Okay, it is just a non-issue. Now, there are reasons why we need to pay attention to pH, because, for example, some antibiotics are pH sensitive, and if the pH of the water is incorrect for the medication you're delivering in the water system, then that medication could just settle out and not be effective. So if you're putting medication into your water to deliver it to the pigs through the drinking water, make sure you talk to your veterinarian or to the supplier of the medication and make sure if there is a pH requirement of that medication or vaccine for that matter, that you have the pH at the right place. It's not hard to change the pH. There's lots of organic acids we use that will lower the pH, or bases to raise it. So that's not a particularly bad issue. Okay, but that's something to keep in mind, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Let's just spend a few minutes on biofilms. Biofilms are new for a number of reasons, but one of them is that we're finding that they're really difficult to deal with. They will grow and proliferate in your water lines. And what makes biofilms different than just regular bacteria is that biofilms are made up of more than one bacteria. There's 2 or more bacteria present, sometimes many more than that, and possibly fungi, and they all work together to help each other out. It becomes a kind of a symbiotic relationship. And then they create this colony of themselves, and then they cover themselves over with this cover, which is really resistant to antibiotics or anything else. And so, as I say on this slide or the next slide, I guess the next slide, that these biofilms are up to 1,500 times less susceptible to antibiotics than regular bacteria are. So they can be really tough to deal with. They can affect the flow of water in your lines, as you can see the picture right there. And biofilm are all around us. So it's not just like they're growing in your water lines and nowhere else. Dental plaque is a biofilm, and you know how hard the dental technician works to scrape biofilm off your dental plaque off your teeth. It's tough stuff. Pond scum is also another example of biofilm. So they're very common, and they've been around for 3 billion years. So they've figured out how to survive a lot of different circumstances. So how do we control biofilm? So if I got them, what do I do about them? Well, there are options that are available. Hydrogen peroxide is a simple way. And one option that we would recommend is, if you have a problem, and maybe if you don't, just to prevent it, is to get a 1 to 3% solution of hydrogen peroxide, put that in your water lines after you've closed out a barn, leave it in there for 24 to 48 hours, and then flush it through. Okay. Another option would be to use chlorination, and you can chlorinate in many different ways. You can use chlorine dioxide, you can use hypochloric acid, hypochlorous acid. There's all kinds of ways of dealing with chlorination, and they all work. The nice thing about hydrogen peroxide is, to be effective, the bacteria, other than biofilms, we just talk about other bacteria that might be around, the time that they are exposed to the hydrogen peroxide doesn't have to be very long for the hydrogen peroxide to be effective. Whereas with chlorination, the time at which the chlorine is exposed to the bacteria must be considerably longer than with hydrogen peroxide. And then the final option is you can use various sanitizers, disinfectants that you don't have to worry about pigs drinking that water. Vircon's an example. I mean, pigs can drink water with chlorine in it. Lots of pigs do. That's not a problem. But there you have to be careful you don't let the chlorine get too high. What's called free chlorine, because if it gets too high, the pigs will back off water real quick. And if they back off water, then they back off feed, right? So finally, the final topic is problems that we're dealing with using water to deliver medication. And I've given 3 issues. There are others, but I think these are the 3 main ones to talk about. The first is that if you're using nipple drinkers, especially nipple drinkers fixed to the wall or penning, they waste a lot of water. Harold Gagne's work would suggest that that type of a nipple drinker, even if it's managed very well and located very well, will waste at least 30% of the water that flows through it. Well, if you're wasting 30% of the water, of drinking water, you're also wasting 30% of your medication, right? So people use wet dry feeders because they don't waste near as much feed or water, pardon me. Or some people use dish type drinkers because they don't waste near as much water. Obviously, you can go to nipple drinkers, the swinging drinkers, they waste less water than fixed drinkers. So there's options out there, but whatever water is being wasted, now we're also wasting an equivalent amount of medication. Second problem is, generally medications are delivered on the basis of certain quantity per day, and but water intake varies a lot. Not only within the barn, but from day to day, during the day, night and daytime and so on, and with season. So in the summertime, for example, pigs will drink, at least in hot weather, will drink at least 50% more water than they do in the wintertime. And so how do you determine the right concentration of the medication in the water if you don't have a good handle on the amount of water these pigs are drinking? And so I think going forward, as we try to be more precise in our use of medications, we're going to pay more attention to measuring how much water the pigs are drinking, so we can get that concentration correct. And then the third issue is whether the medicator is mixing the medication into the drinking water at the right concentration. And that's not an easy thing to measure. It's not difficult, but it takes time. And if you got lots of other things to do, it's one of those things that rarely gets done. And yet it's really important because you want to make sure the medicator is getting its job done. To properly administer medication via the water, we have to know what normal water intake patterns are in our barn. The pH is also very important. As I mentioned earlier, certain medications, certain vaccines need a certain pH to be delivered via the water, and you need to discuss that with your veterinarian or your supplier of the product to make sure that you've got that right. And then if you have biofilm in your drinking lines, then some of that medication or vaccine will get stuck to the biofilm and not get delivered to the pigs. And of course, that can create problems because you're not getting the medication through. So my take-home messages for you today is, number one, the pig has a pretty high tolerance for a wide range of water quality. That sulfates cause diarrhea, and it can be quite profuse diarrhea, but unless sulfates are very, very high, they don't affect pig performance. Iron in the water might be the biggest pain that you could encounter. If you have iron in your water, you'll know what I'm talking about. Biofilms are becoming a much bigger issue on hog farms. They've been talked about in poultry farms even longer than hog farms. In fact, we get a lot of our information from the poultry folks because they've been doing this longer and have learned things, so we don't have to relearn them. And also that delivery of medication via the water, it's not just an automatic thing. You have to approach it carefully to make sure you get it right. So I want to finish up with two final thoughts, if I may. Number one, I have to say, I wish routine chlorination was more commonly practiced in hog barns. I just think that if we did a shock chlorination of our water system, say between fills, or at least once a year, that would go a long ways to help prevent some problems. And as I talked to you earlier in my presentation, prevention of water problems might be a bigger issue or better strategy than trying to solve water problems once they arise. And so I do believe that over time, we will be doing more disinfection of water. I say chlorination, but it doesn't matter which method you use to disinfect your water lines. I think they will become much more common in the future. And the final one, I didn't mention at all in my talk, but I think this is fairly certain as well. I just don't have a very good timeline in my crystal ball, and my crystal ball isn't really very good anyhow, and that is that water is increasingly a limited resource. You know, we used to think, oh, that's a problem in the desert areas of the world, and it's not a problem for us. Well, we all know there's water supply issues in the west coast of this country already. And some of the aquifers in the Midwest are already, we're taking more water out of them than is being recharged by rainwater and other things that recharge those particular aquifers. And so we know that when water is in short supply, there's three groups of people want to use it. There's industry, there's people, and there's farmers. Now, if you look at those three groups of people, who's most likely to win the argument? Or maybe who's most likely to lose that argument? So I would encourage you to be looking at ways of conserving water now, because at some point in the future, water conservation is going to become much, much more important.